Economics Forum's Impact Summit 2018. I'd like to welcome our panelists. I'm joined today by Urvashi Sahni, the founder and CEO of Study Hall Educational Foundation, and Iman Usman, co-founder of Ruangguru. Today we are going to talk about how education can heal a broken generation. And we're going to also discuss about the title and what that means. But first, this issue briefing is going to really focus on how can we bring education to over 120 million children and teenagers all around the world who are out of schools and enable them to, and their countries to thrive. So let's start at the beginning. Why aren't these kids in school? Is it access? Is it we don't have enough schools? Are they just not going to the schools? What is the problem?
Do you want to start?
It's all of these things, by the way. And I just want to expand the problem a little. Of course, access is a problem. And the MDGs seem to focus on that a great deal. And then two countries, particularly China and India, where the problems were enormous, problems of access and problems of literacy, they put their best foot forward and enrollment did jump. It really jumped high. So that India enrollment went in the 90s and China as well made huge strides. But what happened, and when the SDGs came along, the big problem became not just access, but quality. They found that at first it was a very minimal goal that they had in the MDGs, and in fact there was a lot of criticism of that access to primary education was the goal. And then they found that that's not enough, and that it should definitely mean completion, and the focus shifted to quality. Of course, given the numbers you just cited of many children still being out of school, that is a problem. But I think importantly we should think of not just access and even quality. When you think of quality, I think it's important to define what we mean by quality. All right. Is it just reading, writing? Is it just math and science? Is it just literacy? And if that happens, what kind of problems of the world is it going to solve? So we need to think about all of that. But just to answer your question about access that you mentioned, right? In a country like India, which had much of the problem, and even now there is a problem, and so even though enrollment has jumped, attendance continues to be a problem. So just because they're enrolled, that is no indication of having solved the problem. And dropouts continue, retention is a problem, and of course completion is another problem. So it is access. The budget that India has budgeted for education is minuscule. It was 3%, and it's slowly inched up. Which is nothing compared to many of the developing countries, the developed countries. So one is, of course, not enough resources that are being put into having schools. Secondly, in India particularly, the quality of the schools, public schools, where most children who can't afford it go, is so poor. Teacher absenteeism is very high that people don't see why they should go. And thirdly, there is a thing about the opportunity cost, that is it worth our while sending our children to schools when what is going to happen to them beyond that? Are they able to see beyond education, right? So I think there's a problem from the supply side and there's a problem from the demand side as well. And I know in countries like India, which are so vast and which are highly bureaucratic, and where the problem of scale is enormous, right? We have millions and millions. Our population is 1.2 billion, right? It's huge and growing rapidly. And a large percentage of that is still in rural areas, many of them that have access issues to any kind of services. I think the problem with countries like that is that, one, they're not able to reach some, and governance is a huge issue. Managing the education system is a huge problem. Teacher accountability is so low that there aren't enough teachers, first of all. I was helping with the state of Rajasthan, and do you know that I was shocked at the teacher shortage when we began. 60% shortage. Can you imagine a school where you should have 10 teachers and there are only 4? What do you expect? All right, what can that teacher do? So that was a huge, and there was no teacher accountability. First there was a shortage, then there was attendance, teacher attendance was an issue, and there was no accountability. And resources were not being managed properly. How we fix that is something maybe I could talk about later, but
Maybe you can share with us.
Sure. I think I'm just going to expand what Urvashi has mentioned before on on access and later on quality, right? So the first one, when we talk about access, right now there are over 260 million school-age children that are out of school, and if the trend continues, it's estimated that by 2030 that the number will go up to 400 million, right? And that's sort of like the deadline for the SDGs, right? And the thing is that I think there are a lot of problems. As you mentioned before about resources, when we talk about funding right now, I think international aid that is directed to education right now, if we divide it to every single child, is probably only around $10 per child right now, which is barely enough even to buy a second-hand book, right? So that's one thing. And even international aid that goes to education right now, it's only about over 10%, which is much lower than what it was on 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was 13%. So I think resources is one thing. But second of all, I think when we talk about access, we also talk about cost of schooling. And I think it's not just, about making sure that schools are free, for instance, that, I come from Indonesia and the government has, made significant progress in terms of how we, make basic and secondary education for free, but then there's also cost of schooling, right? Like say transportation costs, cost of uniform, cost of resources like books or other tools that are needed. So I think that's something that makes these kids or the families still have a bit concern of sending their kids to go to school. But other than that, it's also exposure. So for instance, from where I come from, most of the kids, like if their parents are farmers, they would think, maybe I will just end up being a farmer. If my father is a driver, then I will also become a driver. So the horizon is not is not broad enough. They're not exposed with what higher education or going to school can actually bring to them. So one is access. Second is quality. So learning standard in general is just low, right? I just came back from the UN yesterday when we talked as well about this issue, and we talk about how basically even for many Asian and African countries in general, we are about 100 years behind the world's standard today. A lot of people, even in Indonesia, right, think about, oh, maybe yes, there is a divide between big cities and smaller cities, but even in Jakarta, the capital, where over 10 million people live there, the divide is just so huge. There is a recent study done by a professor in Harvard. His name is Lan Pritchard, and what he found is that even for Jakarta kids, it takes 128 years for them to catch up with the average OECD country. And it's a moving target because everybody is moving, and then we're here. So and what he says is that even if, let's say, half of the kids goes to high school, we can only catch up about a seventh of it. If and if, let's say, every kid goes to college, we can only catch up about a half of it. So my point is, just thinking about involvement without actually thinking about quality, as Urvashi has mentioned before, is not gonna bring us anywhere. And we can talk, along about how then we can improve quality. What do we mean by quality education, and so on and so forth.
yeah. Can I
Sure.
add to that a little? I'm very glad that I'm an educator, so I'm very glad that the world is concerned about the state of education. I also think, though, that a lot of that concern is slightly misplaced, right? And this I've heard of, the 100 years behind argument, I've heard of that. And I really want to contest that a little bit. I think we need to understand, first of all, what we mean by development, secondly, what we mean by education, and if we're going to reduce it only to literacy and numeracy, I think that's really narrowing down. And we're totally ignoring local knowledge. We're totally ignoring knowledge that comes out of school. And we cannot equate schooling with education. I think we need to think of all these things when we talk about the 100 years behind.
Yep.
Right? And if it is indeed 100 years behind, which I wonder about, sometimes I think that, I think somebody made this point yesterday, that the developing world, because it is so resource poor and because the crises are so urgent, they in fact are more resourceful. And being resourceful doesn't always come from being schooled, right? So we need to, I think we need to disentangle the problem of education from schooling and not just equate the two. That is one. And secondly, when we talk about quality, I found that whereas everybody's talking about quality and there's a big brouhaha about it, including in India, and when they talk about quality, what they come up with is, oh, fifth grade kids cannot yet read and write a second grade textbook. All right. I want to go beyond that. That there are many quote-unquote high-quality schools here and in India and in the developing world where, they read and write and they can do math and they can do all of that and, they finish, etc. And I have serious questions about the quality of that education too. That, yes, they can do their math and science and their history and geography and they can read and write, etc. But do they have the necessary, the critical skills, the critical imagination? Are they change makers? Do they think critically about real life issues? Is the school allowing any space for that? Is that, I think, our curriculum everywhere, even in high quality schools, are way, way, way outdated. That it is not relevant to the times. We complain about the condition of democracies, and yet we have never educated our children for democracy. And I'll give you a small example. To go back to your title really, about can education heal a broken generation? I don't know about the generation part of it, but let me talk about what kind of an education might heal lives. Let me give you an example of this young girl. I'll give you two. So there was just very recently, just a month ago, I run schools in India, and we particularly focus on girls from very, very marginalized communities. This girl came, she was this high, literally, and she had 4 more, this high, this high, this high, and that high. And so we often have that sisters come with their team of sisters to get enrolled. They come themselves, parents don't come. And so she came in and she says, is this where I get enrollment? I said, yes, and these are your sisters. And she said, no, they're my daughters. I said, oh, really? I said, and how old are you? Well, she didn't know. So we figured it out. And here's the story. She was married at 12, mothered at 13, 15, 17, 19. And then thankfully the husband died. And so she was freed and she didn't have any more children. And right now we calculated she was 23. And she'd brought these two girls. So I said, child, and have you been to school? She says, yes, I've been up to first grade. And then because my mother had babies, I had to stay at home. So I haven't been. So I said, do you want to come? So she says, can I? I said, yes, you can. And so we had her in too. All right. And so now she's there with her 4 daughters, and her 10-year-old is helping her to study. Now, there's Lakshmi, whose mother passed away when she was 13, leaving her own a 1-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, an 11-year-old, and Lakshmi, who was 13, and a father who was drunk. And so Lakshmi, what did she do? She put herself to work in 7 homes, and this one is working in 3 homes, and they were trying to raise each other, and everybody raising the 1-year-old. She came to us. She was in our school. Now, when you have children with these kinds of extreme challenges to their life, so how is literacy, numeracy alone going to help them? Yes, they need that. So we know then that what we do with girls and the way to keep them to school, of course, they must have access. So which is why our school is in the afternoon. So they can work during the day. She would starve, and the 5 girl children would starve if she couldn't work, as would this girl Preeti, who's 23 and trying to raise a family of 4 with no education. Right. So we have it in the afternoon, and of course, it's very, very low cost. It's nothing. And then we've tailored the way we define quality education is that it must teach this girl how to live. And with girls who come with severe challenges, who come with no aspirations, as you mentioned, and with absolutely no view of themselves as having any life or having a self, we try to build that self first, that you must know that you're an equal person, deserving respect, deserving every opportunity in the world, and guess what? You can do anything. And do you know where Lakshmi is now?
No.
She's got an MBA degree. She is earning 35,000. Her younger sister is in college, finishing, and the others are finishing school, right? And they have raised this family. And Preeti will get there soon, I know, with her 4 daughters too. But the point is that I think education must include discussion and thinking and learning about real issues. And I'm telling you, that's not a problem just with India. Look at New York schools and the inner city schools. Look at the inner city schools in San Francisco, the high quality 100-year-ahead schools. The children are in gangs. They had disengaged. There is a huge dropout rate here as well. And when we had an exchange program, my girls had a program with the boys here in Harlem. There was a school there, boys and girls. And so they exchanged videos. So they talked about their gangs and how their lives were impacted by them, and our girls talked about domestic violence. And each one of them, it was amusing. They were both horrified at the other's life. You know, they felt, well, our oppressions we understand, but yours are really bad. And so they were talking about solutions. And you know what our girls told them? They said, hey, wait a minute. Doesn't your school teach you how to deal with your problems? To them, it was perfectly normal that an education is worth nothing unless it teaches you how to deal with your problems, you know. And that's my point. When we're lamenting this 100 years behind, etc., which I don't buy, by the way, and is that, that really, let's look at the 100-year ahead. All the nuclear problems, all the climate change problems, where are they coming from? So we have more math and science and everything. And what has it done to the world? Right? Look at the wonderful condition of the world with all the math and science, etc., that's been streaming ahead. And soon we'll have robotics and human beings will be redundant. Right? So my point is that we really need, education is in crisis. It's been in crisis for a while. Right? But what we need to look at is that, all right, yes, kids need to go to school, and maybe schooling is not the only answer. Maybe there's a different way to organize education. Right? But what are we teaching? How are we teaching it? What are we expecting? What is an educated person?
So
Those are questions to ask.
So my question to you both is, talking about this education and this education with purpose, what would it look like? And let's first go with that question, and then think about, you know, here at the World Economic Forum, we talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution and the fact that there is, you know, robots, AI, all of this coming at. How do you integrate that change into that education with purpose? So, Usman.
Well, I believe that, you know, when we think about education in the future, then we think about and how can we provide the opportunities for all learners, not only to be, you know, economically productive, you know, develop sustainable livelihoods, but also, you know, contribute to peaceful and democratic, societies, as mentioned before, and to do so, that it means that we need to go beyond, you know, just teaching the fundamentals, you know, teaching the basics, like, as you mentioned before, teaching about math, numeracy, literacy, and all those things. But then how can we provide all the 21st century, skills that are needed? Basically, how can they think, how can they learn, how they basically, problem solve, how can they, think creatively, how to build empathy, and so on and so forth. And then to respond to your question before, how do we try to integrate technology, you know, in this rapid changing world, is that we try to use the technology to escalate, the change that we need to make. So I'm working in, so we have a for-profit with a social mission company called Ruangguru in Indonesia. So what we're doing is basically we try to provide learning solutions for kids through different vehicles. We have learning video subscription, we give them access to private tutoring, we have classroom management, online exam platform, you know, short courses, so on and so forth. Right now we're serving about 10 million students in the country, and we have been able to do that, you know, by, you know, optimizing the use of technology. Of course, technology is not the only answer, but we believe that, you know, given the circumstances that we have today, we have 4 million teachers, and according to World Bank, more than 50% of them are not qualified for teaching for a lot of different reasons. It is really important in how, you know, we try to use technology like what we're doing, mobile learning, so that we can escalate that. So instead of, we still need to do teacher training and try to improve this 4 million teachers, but then thinking about how can we, you know, scale the quality learning, and making sure that everybody, wherever they are, then they have access to the quality learning.
Yeah. You know, I want to add to what Iman said, that on the one, I think the future, we do really, I said we need to envision education differently, and we also need to envision schools differently, right? Perhaps there won't be schools the way we have them today. Perhaps there will be more community-based centers in areas in rural areas. And Pan, we need to also rethink, I think we need to think a little harder about AI and the technology, etc. Trying to understand that there's a large part of the world, when we talk about the 21st century, I'm telling you, I live in Lucknow, which is in North India. And this is in Uttar Pradesh, and it's the largest province it has a population of 200 million, and the US, by the way, has 300 million. So just to give you a sense of how large it is. And even there, if I were to go to my rural school, which is about 30 kilometers away, and look around, you're almost going back 15 or 20 years. Right? So that is just in one geographical region. So when you're talking about distant countries, when you're talking about developed, this part of the world, right? And you talk about 21st century. Where is the rest of the world, and are they in the 21st century? Which century? I think so we have to be careful when we talk about 21st century. And we talk about, robotics is coming and artificial intelligence is coming. I don't see it coming a long, long time in many parts of rural India and many parts of rural Africa and many parts of the world as yet, and probably the most largely populated parts of the world. So I think the problems there are not really what will we do with artificial intelligence and robotics, and is the world going to change so rapidly. I think part of the brief that education should have, I've heard a lot about what are the 21st century skills that children need to cope with the new workforce requirement. I think more importantly, we should be thinking that children should, of course, learn how to cope with the time. Right. But more importantly, they should also learn how to shape the times and how to shape the future. That is it necessary? Do we want robots doing things for us when people don't have jobs as yet, right? I have huge trouble with this, by the way. This assumption that as though we're on some kind of a juggernaut and it's going in this uncontrolled way, then why do you have World Economic Forums and why do you have any of this? If it's going to happen in any case, well, let it happen. We'll see what happens then, right? But if we want a sustainable planet, we want a sustainable world, so we must also think, I think, hard that what's the kind of future we want? And are our children being equipped to also shape the future? Right? And now just, my wish, sometimes whenever I hear debates of the 100-year ahead and all the kinds of the huge imbalances in the globe, I really wish people would just stop for a while and let others catch up. If it's a catch-up game that we're playing. If it's not a catch-up game that we're playing, then let 1,000 flowers bloom and let people develop their own models of development, their own models of education and what works in the circumstances that they are, without having some kind of a universal standard and then saying they are 100 years ahead and these are 100 years behind, forgetting colonial histories and legacies, of course, all the time, that who's responsible for the 100 years gap, first of all. But I wish we would have a way of letting local solutions emerge. And in this whole attempt to find global solutions, of course, then you will have these huge imbalances, and then you're having a global standard for comparison, which I don't think is justified at all in any way, because they are not in the same place in history.
So, digging deeper into that, you highlighted the need for local solution, but you also talked about how your province had 200 million people. So how do you scale up those solutions? And you gave some examples of that, but how do you do it in a way that's also still inclusive and does not, as you said, wash out the variance that exist in these when we're looking for universal solutions. So maybe you can share a little bit more about your examples.
So at Ruangguru, we believe that technology is not a divider, but it is an equalizer. I mean, there is an opportunity where technology can be, non-inclusive, but we're trying not to do that, right? So we're thinking about, when we think about, we're thinking about what are the barriers for kids or parents or even teachers to access technology. So for instance, we're thinking about, maybe they do not have reliable internet data. So what we're doing is that first we are partnering with telco provider, the largest telco provider in Indonesia, where we basically have our own data package. So kids who subscribe to that data package, they basically, do not have to pay extra when they access our content. So by paying the same amount of the money that same for the credit that they typically subscribe to, they can also access our content for basically without paying anything. The second one, the problem that okay, maybe I don't have to pay extra, but the connection is just not there, particularly when we talk about rural areas. So we're trying to adjust a lot of our solutions so that it can also be fed and be used in that kind of context. So for instance, even though all the learning solutions that we have are delivered to mobile, but we also have what we call USB on the go. So we basically use the USB, which can be connected to a phone. So when they're loading our content, it's not loaded from the cloud, but it's actually loaded from the USB. So it doesn't require internet in that sense. But the USB itself, it's encrypted, so it also protects our content. So these are two things that, let's say, for instance, the way we think about how can we basically make it more inclusive. But I think other than that, when we think about using technology for education, we also need to realize that there is a knowledge gap. There's a divide in know-how gap. Yes, you have access to technology, but how can you really take advantage of that? For instance, we generate a lot of data for education, but then people do not really know how to use that data. We talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about that it can provide recommendations, but they just do not know how to actually use it. So it means that after having the data, then we still need to teach them, we still need to empower them more or less, or even so that they can actually make their own decisions given the data that they have. So a lot of actually extra works, additional requirements that we need to think, and these are the kind of the thoughts or problems that we typically might not encounter in a more developed world. So I think that's just some of the examples that I have.
Yeah. So I'll tell you how we have used technology. What we did, and we've been doing this since 2005, and that was the time when internet had not got the penetration, and even the mobile penetration was not as great as it is now, even in India, even in a province like Uttar Pradesh. What we did was that we found that there are resource-rich schools in urban centers where there are good teachers, they're fully equipped, etc. And then there are these very resource-poor schools where there might be 300 children and 2 teachers in rural areas. Public schools, private schools, all kinds of schools. And in India, private schools, there's a wide range, right? You have very low-end private schools, and then you have very high-end private schools, and many in between. So what we did was that we would video just simple handheld camps, so very inexpensive, good classes where teachers taught in very active pedagogies, and they even use critical pedagogies. And then we turned them into DVDs and shipped them to the village, set up a simple DVD in a classroom, because Bollywood is very popular in India, and everyone knows how to use that. If they don't know how to use anything else, they know how to use that. And we made these lessons, and that was very successful. So we were sharing resources. And now what we started to do is all our material is on YouTube. There's a national teacher platform. And so it's accessed by millions of teachers, and students can access it. They learn how to teach better, and students can access it when there aren't any teachers. And we've included even our critical pedagogy, our critical dialogues are on that too. And now what people can do is they can access it on their phones, because mobile penetration in India is huge. Yeah. And not just that, we also are able to support our teachers after we've trained them using the mobile. We set up a little call center, and so a very small number of people can problem shoot using simple telecalling. And then we built communities of teachers, communities of students on WhatsApp, etc., so that they can be helping each other, and there can be a huge amount of peer learning. So yes, technology can help. And in the state of Rajasthan, where I work with the chief minister there, what they've done is they've used video conferencing to help train. And again, they use groups of WhatsApp very, very effectively. And they have, in fact, worked very hard at learning how to use data, that you have the data. Yeah. They've set up portals. And now, for example, just a simple one that I told you, they had a shortage of teachers. Not only did they have a shortage, so they had found that they didn't know whether they had enough math teachers or they had enough social. They just didn't know, because they had no data. Yeah. Finally, they set up this MIS portal, and within a day and a half, 150,000 teachers were able to log on and put in their subject areas. And they found that they had a huge preponderance of social studies teachers and great shortage of math teachers. And then they were able to recruit them properly and move them into the classrooms, to your point. Right. So I think to scale, you need to do several things. And we also have the open schooling system, which we're trying to use, where we are in communities. Our school, for example, we have a rural school in a block. And children come from 44 villages. So what are we doing? We're getting our children to go into their villages and scout and find out how many girls are out of school. If there are 140 in a school, why are they out of school? They got married, they can't go, their parents won't let them. Then we said, okay, let's use the National Open School. And why don't you help as a buddy and help these students to learn? And we can give you on your mobile some of the lessons that they will need. And what we do, what they get out of that is they get a small stipend, which helps, which is an incentive, and they get a scholarship for their fee as well. So that is really working very well. So there are these small community centers with 10, 15, 20 girls that these children are helping, and they're using the National Open Schooling so that a lot of it is self-learning. They can come for 2 days. Right.
So as you can see, we can talk about this forever, but we're running out of time. But I wanted to provide one opportunity for any questions if there are in the room. If not, I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you. It has been illuminating at the scale of the problem, but also the opportunities that are there and the solutions that are there if people are willing to take action like you two. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us.